Welcome to the Daily Devo. My name's Joel, and today we're talking about serving God in our weakness. I want to start with a question. Have you ever felt like because of what you've done wrong, the mistakes you've made, that God can't use you? Today, we're continuing in Ephesians chapter 3, and the Apostle Paul is doing something right up front. He's making it clear that he is being used by God in miraculous ways to spread the gospel. And so I want to jump into Ephesians chapter 3, starting in verse 7. It says this: I became a servant of this gospel by the gift of God's grace given me through the working of his power. Although I am less than the least of all God's people, this grace was given to me to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ and to make plain to everyone the administration of this mystery, for which for ages past was kept hidden in God, who created all things. So in our passage today, Paul starts by highlighting the fact that he is being used by God to spread the gospel, to do amazing things, to bring the good news of Jesus to the Gentiles. And he's talking to the Gentiles in Ephesus, and he's highlighting that God is using him, but then he actually goes further and highlights why that's a big deal. Paul actually refers to himself as less than the least of God's people. And at first glance, this might seem like a harsh criticism that Paul has of himself. When you and I think of Paul, we think of some lofty leader of the early church who is responsible for writing a ton of the New Testament, and yet Paul refers to himself as less than the least of God's people, clearly identifying in himself some of his shortcomings and weaknesses and even his mistakes. And this isn't the only time that Paul does this. In fact, in 1 Timothy, he actually calls himself the chief of sinners. And at first glance, this may seem like Paul has a lowly view of himself. But in reality, I think what Paul's trying to communicate is a very high view of God and his ability to use even the most broken people. What he's trying to call out is that God has used, will continue to use, and loves to use broken and imperfect people who, by human standards, might not be worthy of being used to accomplish his purposes. And I want to remind us that this is Paul that we're talking about, who was formerly known as Saul and who was most well known for being responsible for ordering the execution of early Christian leaders. What Paul is saying is, if God can use me, then he can use anyone. Paul's talking about how our weaknesses are not a barrier for God to use us. And so the takeaway for you and I today is to not look at ourselves and our brokenness, but instead to look at God, who doesn't see our shortcomings, our mistakes, and our weaknesses as a barrier to the movement of the gospel that he wants to have come about. It's echoing 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9, where Paul says, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more greatly about my weakness so that Christ's power may rest on me." Paul is making the case that even though he's made numerous mistakes and has countless weaknesses, God is still able and willing to use him in mighty ways. And so the simple takeaway for us today is to believe that he can use us too. If God can use Paul, someone who is actually working in opposition to the Christian faith, it would be silly for us to believe that we're too far gone and God can't use us. And so the invitation is to understand and then to reckon as true, to remind yourself that God can use you, that he is intimately aware of your weaknesses and intimately face to face with your brokenness and mistakes. And instead of seeing them as a barrier, he actually sees them as an opportunity to not only move the kingdom of God forward, but bring more glory to himself. So would you let God use you today? Thanks for joining us on the Daily Devo.